In August 1619, at Point Comfort, Virginia, 20 Africans taken from the Ndongo region of Angola were put ashore and traded to men in the starving Jamestown colony for provisions from the Dutch ship that had brought the Africans to America. These were the first Africans on record to be forcibly settled as involuntary laborers in the North American British colonies. These blacks, who are identified by names such as Antonio, Isabella, Francis, and Peter, were not recognized by the settlers as slaves. English common law did not acknowledge chattel slavery, the ownership of human beings as property. Census counts of the 1623 and 1624 listed these Angolans as servants. Furthermore, there was no race within Jamestown society identified as white. 71 years after the 1624 Jamestown census, the colony of Virginia adopted the slave codes of 1705, making it the law, not just a practice, that black, mulatto, and Indian slaves would be held as pieces of property that, like horses and cattle, could be sold, bartered, or bequeathed in a will. Since the history of the United States is unescapably linked to the issue of slavery, Jim Crow, and white supremacy, it appears critically important to understand how Africans went from servants to slaves and emerged indelibly marked as an inferior race. Hi, I'm Tom Army, and this is another challenging episode of United States History Online. Before we go any further, I need to add a footnote. While this episode focuses on Virginia, I want you to appreciate that the transition from indentured servitude to slavery took place gradually, one colony at a time, one law at a time. The idea of indentured servitude was born out of a need for cheap labor. The early settlers required laborers on their plantations to grow and process tobacco and generate significant wealth for the owners of the property. England had skilled and unskilled laborers who needed work. To attract them to the New World, planters offered free passage across the Atlantic in exchange for 4 to 7 years of labor. The work was harsh, punishments were severe. Many did not live long enough to earn their freedom. Those who did survive the ordeal did get their freedom and did receive payment in the form of land granted to them for farming. Historians estimate that 80% of the white colonists who arrived in the 17th century colony of Virginia came in this manner, a manner we refer to as indentures. Since no slave laws were in place in 1619 when the initial Dutch ship arrived with Africans, Angolans such as Antonio and Peter were initially treated as indentured servants and consequently were given the same opportunities as whites. Court records indicate that Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson and married a black servant named Mary. Together they had 4 children. Their children became free and owned land, cattle, and their own indentured servants. Note, however, that Anthony Johnson worked longer than was typical of white indentured servants before gaining his freedom. Yet in 1655, Johnson sued his white neighbor for the return of a runaway servant and won his case in court. That same year, Johnson and his family moved to Maryland, and he leased his 300-acre plantation back in Virginia. Despite Anthony Johnson's success as a plantation owner, racial distinctions were appearing in the 1640s. For example, John Punch, a black servant, ran away with two other white servants from their master, Hugh Gwynn. After the three were captured, the two whites were sentenced to each serve an additional year of servitude. But Punch was ordered, quote, to serve his master for the time of his natural life here elsewhere, end quote. In 1650, only 400 Africans were in the colony among 19,000 settlers. But some of those blacks, like John Punch, were serving their masters for life. In Virginia, the legalization of slavery occurred in response to the growing perceptions of a labor shortage. The falling English birth rate in the 1660s, the high rate of disease-related deaths, and the declining number of English men and women willing to indenture themselves raised a significant concern about sustaining the economic wealth of the colony. Furthermore, something else was brewing. Indentured servants seemingly began to pose a threat to the property-owning Tidewater elite. By 1670, many white and black freeholders began to confront the entrenched wealthy planters. Former indentured servants went looking for land to farm in western Virginia, and they wanted the frontier natives there expelled or exterminated. At issue was whether the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, would provide military protection for these newly minted freemen. Wealthy planters along the seacoast instead wanted a ready supply of tenant farmers and wage laborers. Governor Berkeley and the established planter merchants who traded with the Native Americans for furs wanted to maintain peace with the Indians to continue their lucrative trading. Furthermore, Berkeley had bestowed large land grants to members of his council of supporters and even exempted their lands from taxation. To suppress any dissent over his action from the House of Burgesses, Berkeley bought off legislators with lucrative appointments as sheriffs, tax collectors, and such. Unrest understandably increased when the corrupt Burgesses changed the voting system to exclude landless freemen. As a result of the political corruption in 1676, a young English planter recently arrived in Virginia, Nathaniel Bacon, organized and led an uprising against the corrupt Berkeley government. Known as Bacon's Rebellion, the rebels demanded fairer tax laws, voting rights, and protection from Indian raids in the western part of the colony. White and black indentured servants, freeholders, and small farmers enthusiastically joined the rebellion. With an army of 400 men, Bacon marched on Jamestown in 1676, and he burnt it to the ground. The army then plundered the plantation of Berkeley's favored allies. Unfortunately, Nathaniel Bacon's successful quest for justice proved short-lived. Bacon died of dysentery, and the defeated governor took both his opportunity and his revenge. He took back the property of the well-to-do rebels. He hanged 23 of them. But all was not lost. A newly elected House of Burgesses did enact some political reforms, which included curbing the power of the governor and the council and restoring voting rights to landless freemen. The planter and governing elite should have learned a lesson from Bacon's rebellion. They had witnessed black and white indentured servants joining together to fight for reform. This bonding of blacks and poor whites portended a troubling alliance against the wealthy elite. Furthermore, the growing reliance on African slaves for labor, coupled with a decline in indentured servants, drove the House of Burgesses to a fateful decision to commit future generations of Americans to a social system based on racial exploitation. This decision fanned the flames of growing class tensions in this evolving society. In 1680, a new Virginia law prohibited slaves the freedom of assembly and the right to carry weapons. In 1682, another act required church wardens to read the 1680 and 1682 slave code twice a year during worship services. In 1691, a statute prohibited interracial marriage or sexual relationships, seeking to prevent, quote, the abominable mixture of spurious issues by Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, end quote. Then, in 1705, Virginia took the tragic step and declared, quote, a Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held to be real estate, end quote. Chattel slavery finally arrived. The confrontation between wealthy planters and young landless laborers rocked Virginia in the second half of the 17th century. This struggle, historian James A. Henretta pointed out, quote, left a contradictory legacy. A decrease in class conflict among whites, a greater reliance on black slaves, and the dehumanization of an entire race of people, end quote. In 1955, historian C. Van Woodward published The Strange Career of Jim Crow. He argued that, like chattel slavery, segregation was a late 19th century invention to create, quote, legally prescribed, rigidly enforced, statewide Jim Crowism, end quote. It was not inevitable. Furthermore, the heyday of legalized segregation came at the same time as the liberal progressive period. Liberals, too, accepted the color line for a variety of reasons, but racism was embedded in the core. To explore this northern racism more fully, in our next episode, we turn to a study of slavery in the North. What do you expect to learn? There may be some surprises.